Oh, so happy Mother's Day. Let me get my message up and going here. With the sleep. So there was a husband that he wanted to really show his appreciation to his wife. And it was Mother's Day weekend, and he was coming home from work, and he saw a vendor on the side of the road. So he decided, I'm going to stop and give her a couple dozen roses. And so he gets her a couple dozen roses, and he gets to the house, and he, instead of going in, he said, I'm going to stand at the door and ring the doorbell. And so he rings the doorbell, and she comes to the door, and she just breaks down and starts crying. And he goes, honey, what's wrong? She goes, I had a terrible day. The dishwasher broke down and flooded the whole kitchen. The kids have been just absolutely just little terrors all day. The washing machine, it just broke down and ripped up all of our clothes. It's just terrible. And now you come home drunk. We need to show our wives and our mothers more appreciation. Several years ago, someone was interviewing a contemporary artist. His name was Mark Chagall, and it was on a PBS program. And the young artist who was being interviewed was, and the interviewer was young and was asking questions about who influenced them most in their lives. His questions were very long and involved and exhibited his learning along the way, giving everybody, including Chagall, how he had influenced his life. When the young man finally gave the artist a chance to answer for himself, Chagall said, in the simplest, most way, greatest influence on his life was his mother. It took the poor young interviewer a bit of time to get his bearings after that, but I know of no one who makes more permanent imprint in our lives than our mothers. I guess that's why, Mother's Day always leaves me a little nostalgic. I love my mother. My mother's 93 years old. I spent yesterday with her and Friday with her, and it was just a wonderful time because I know those days are short. And many of us, our mothers are no longer here, and we remember the love, though, that they put into our lives. And we see their voice coming out of our mouth as we talk to our kids, and we say, I'll never say that to my kids. And then all of a sudden it's like, where's my mom? Where's my dad? And they're really one of the real heroines in our world that really don't get the credit they deserve. So hats off to every one of you who are mothers. And even if you don't have children, I'm going to talk about a mother and a woman in the Bible who had a motherly heart, who really had no children. More than any statesman or teachers, more than any minister or physician, more than any film star, athlete, business person, author, scientist, civic leader, entertainer, or military hero, you women are the greatest influence in your children's life. And it really is true, the old saying, she who rocks the cradle rules the world. Never doubt that fact. Not even when the dishes in the sink seem to be the Leaning Tower of Pisa. My daughter-in-law, I went over to their house, and she's been busy all week, and she has a cottage industry, and she was apologizing over and over and over about her house and what it looked like. And I'm going, you're a mom, you got 3 kids, all under the age of 5. I don't know how you do it. She got 1 hour of sleep last night because the newborn baby, a couple months old, decided not to sleep last night. So mom didn't sleep last night, And when the washing machine chokes and dies, when the place looks like a wreck, and nobody at home stops and says, thank you, Mom, it's still worth it. There'll never have been an Isaac without a Sarah, a Moses without a Jochebed, a Samuel without his godly mother Hannah, a John without Elizabeth, a Timothy without his godly mother Eunice, his grandmother Lois, or a John Mark without a Mary. But I'm going to talk to you about someone in the Bible named Deborah, and also about another one named Barak. And Deborah we find her in Judges, and she was one of the judges over Israel. And Deborah's name means honeybee. That's what it means. And Barak means thunderbolt. And we find their story in Judges. See, what happened when Israel when Joshua died, Israel started falling apart. And now a whole new generation had been raising up, and they were falling away from the plan that God had for them. They were starting to walk away from the Lord. They were starting to get pagan gods and all those things. And God, he raised up Israel for a purpose. Because in Genesis, it said God loved all mankind, and he had a purpose and plan, and he does for all mankind. But we know in Genesis that, we see Adam and Eve fell, and then all of a sudden, man became more and more wicked. And so God flooded the earth, start over again, with a family, with Noah and his family. And then again, we saw people rose up, worshiped God, and then as generations went on, they fell away from God. And we see the city of Babel, and they rose up this great tower thinking that they could become greater than God. And God's dispersed them. And so now God is saying, after in a little bit of history going up to around, so he decided to work with one nation. And he decided that they were going to be different, and that they were going to be a nation that modeled for all the nations, a nation that loved God and served God. And they were going to be different from other nations because they were going to have a king. They were going to have what was called a theocracy. And a theocracy would be that God would rule their people. And he would speak, as he spoke to Moses and then he spoke to Joshua. But then as the tribes dispersed and the generations started to get away and they weren't possessing the land like they were supposed to and things were happening, God raised up judges. And one of those judges was a woman. And her name was Deborah. And Deborah was to take on the role of ruling and reigning over people and giving judgments. And so God allowed what happened because the people were rebelling. God allowed pagan nations to come in. The Canaanites started coming in and taking away their land, and they were stealing things from them. And the people of Israel were hiding in the caves, and they were having to take back ways to travel anywhere because the Canaanites were coming in and destroying them. And yet God raised up a woman, a Deborah. And can God use a woman? Absolutely. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because I was thinking about just a few weeks ago when we ordained women here into the callings that God has on your lives, the giftings that God has on your life, and the purpose and the plans that God has on your lives. See, Deborah was not only a judge, but she was also a prophetess. She could speak prophetically the things of God to the people. She was a prophetess, she was a judge, and she was a woman. And yet when she was raised up, they were surrounded by enemies and terrible things were happening. And she had to become a woman who had to learn to battle against the enemies and save her nation. And so she would have court, and she would have court under this big palm tree. And people would come and they would share with her their problems. And they kept coming to her and saying, those Canaanites, they're causing us problems, Deborah. Those Canaanites, you've got to do something. They're stealing all of our crops, and they're stealing all of our animals, and they're just destroying our lives. She's like, turn back to God. And they said, we're stuck in the mountains, we're just stuck up there, and all we can do is we can eat berries. Do you really care? And she goes, yeah, I care. And God cares. And she writes this beautiful poem or sonnet in Judges chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 6. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned, because the people had to hide. Travelers took to winding paths. Villages in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose. Until I arose, a mother in Israel. God chose new leaders. When the war came to the city gates, but not a spear or a shield was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. I love how she says there, and Deborah, from what we see, she didn't have children, but she said there, I love what she said, there arose within her a mother's heart for Israel. a mother's heart for Israel. She cared enough to use the gifts that God had given her, and she was God's honeybee. She was the bee that was to sting the people into action and motivate them to go to battle and fight. But all the time, she did that, not because she wanted to see them destroyed, but she wanted to see them come back to the promises that God had for them, the things that God had for them. She had that mother's heart. It's okay. So Deborah became involved politically as a judge. She became involved socially with the people. She became relational with them, meeting with them and talking with them. She became emotional in the fact that her emotions got into the thing. And that's what people say, oh, women, they can't be good leaders, they're just too emotional. Maybe we need little emotions. Maybe we need some compassion. Maybe, and that's just not true. Yeah. Spiritually gifted and talented. Margaret Thatcher was a great leader, and she was a woman. In her song, and she was a very talented woman, in her song in Hebrew, in Judges, in the Hebrew culture, is considered one of the most powerful masterpieces of poetry in the Hebrew history. Just the way she wrote and the things she did. So she was talented. And she arose that mother in Israel. She had that maternal sense for the people of Israel that she would have for her children. There was a teenager who, and she was, and before I get to that, she was willing to even lay down her own life for her people. And that's what mothers do, don't you? Your children, you'll lay down your life for them. Because you love them. God just put something within your heart for your children. And I just, like Terry was saying up here, she just loves her children. She loves her grandchildren. I was sitting on the couch yesterday with my grandson, and he one of them likes to sleep in. The older one, the younger one, the 3-year-old likes to get up early. So we're up at 7 o'clock. And that's sleeping in for me, because I usually get up about 5:30 to do my devotion time and stuff. But I took the day off yesterday, so I'm going to hell. And so anyway, no, I'm not. But, and so I went upstairs, and here he is, he's sitting there. And so I go and I sit down beside him and have my coffee. And all of a sudden, he just gets up and comes over and just gives me a big hug and just sits there for a while. It just melted my heart. I mean, those little ones, it's just unconditional love. And I'm like, oh, that's wonderful. Well, there was a teenager who didn't want to be seen in public with her mother because her mother's arms were terribly disfigured. One day, her mother took her shopping and she reached out her hand and the clerk looked horrified. Later, crying, the girl told her how embarrassed she was of her mother's disformities. Understandably hurt, the mother waited an hour before going to the daughter's room to tell her, for the first time in her life, what had happened. She said, darling, when you were a baby, I woke up to a burning house. Your room was an inferno. Flames were everywhere. I could have gotten out the front door, but I decided I'd rather die with you than leave you to die alone. I ran through the fire, wrapped my arms around you, and then I went back through the flames. My arms were on fire. When I got you outside on the lawn, the pain was so agonizing. But when I looked at you, all I could was rejoice that the flames had not touched you. Stunned, the girl looked at her mother through new eyes. Weeping in shame and gratitude, she kissed her mother's marred hands and arms. That mother cared enough. And every mother, that's our heart. We care enough to lay down our life for our kids. And that was Deborah. She was cared enough that she was going to use the gifts that God gave her to be able to bring the people back to God. And so God used her, and God spoke to her and said, raise up a man named Barak. And Barak was a mighty man of God, and he was, one of God's best. But he had lacked a little self-confidence. And so she went to him and she said, we need to raise up an army, and we need to do something, and we need to take back the land that God has promised us. And Barak said, I'll do it, but not unless you go with me. He was a man who was not threatened by a woman's gifting. And he saw that with both of us, that we could be used by God to do what God has called us to do. And so they raised up 10,000 troops, and the king of the opposing army saw this happening. And so he got together 900 iron chariots ready, and so he took off to Galilee to try to fight this army that raised up. Now, chariots are wonderful when you get to a place where there's plains and fields and stuff, they're good. But what happened is they had to cross some rivers. And when they got to the rivers and the place where they were supposed to cross, Deborah, she knew that God was the one who was in control. She knew that God, she saw the bigger picture. And that as mothers and as fathers, we need to see the bigger picture. I remember Joyce saying to me that one day she said to God, these girls are yours. I can't take it anymore. I laughed, and now I realize as a father what that means. Because we can't take that burden on, but we realize that God has called you each for a plan and a purpose, and Deborah was called for a plan and a purpose. And she knew, and she said to Barak, and she said, you know what? Let's look at the bigger picture. The victory is ours, but the battle is the Lord's. And that's the same is true with our lives as we're raised up for this time and this generation to raise up our children and our grandchildren. Yeah, there's going to be battles. Yeah, there's going to be times, like my daughter, she came out as my daughter-in-law. She was just frazzled, and she's like, I got slept, and and just the baby's crying and needing to be fed, and my son's frustrated because I was holding the baby trying to make her not cry, and then he was in, and she comes out, she's like this, and I go, Happy Mother's Day. You will look back on these days. But what happened is when these chariots got to the rivers, God overflowed the rivers. He flooded them. And what happens when horses get stuck in mud? They don't go anywhere, do they? And what happened is those horses got stuck in there in that mud, and the firepower of the enemy, the chariots started falling over and all that stuff. And then what happened is Barak, the thunderbolt, he and 10,000 men came down upon the Canaanites and attacked them. Wow. So why am I talking about Deborah? Because we need to be like Deborah. She was a fighter, and she knew who was ultimately in control. We need men and women today in our society more than ever who rise up to be fighters. We need to fight on our knees in prayer. We need to stand up and say, God has a plan. God has a purpose. Don't worry about it. People are telling me, why are you building a house? Well, the problem is I already started. I'm not going to stop right now. Got a basement. I'm not going to leave it there for a couple of years. Yeah, things are going crazy. I talked to the plumber. He goes, I can't get fiberglass anymore. Showers are 6 months out. Another thing. So we found a shower guy, provided. And so, but she was a fighter, and she knew who her commander ultimately was. If we're going to change our world, we need to become fighters. God has called us to do it. Just as he called Deborah and Barak to do it, God equipped her as a prophetess, as a leader, as a talented woman, as having a mother's heart. Souls are at stake, people. Christ is our commander, and we are his soldiers. Amen? Just as with Esther, I love what she said. Maybe I was born for just a time as this, because, people said to her, if you go before the king, you could die. She goes, yeah, but my people are going to die. God gave her a mother's heart for the Jews. And she said, you know what? It'll be worth it. Because maybe I was created for such a time as this, and you know the story. She did save her people from mass destruction. We need to see the bigger picture, just like Barak did. And like Barak, yeah, we're going to go to battle. But the Lord of hosts is with us. And you trust him, he will take over. and he will need you. And so, ladies and men too, it's an unseen battle, but you do have a lot of influence in your kids' lives. My mother taught me many things. My mother taught me religion. Okay, when I was spilling grape juice on the carpet, she would say, "You better pray that stain comes out of that carpet." She taught me logic with her decisive words of saying, "Because I said so, that's why." She taught me foresight. Make sure you wear clean underwear. Why? Because you might be in an accident. You all know it, you know. I don't think they're going to be concerned about my underwear, Mom. She taught me irony. Keep laughing, Larry, and I'll give you something to laugh about. Yeah. My mom taught me stamina. You sit there till all that spinach is gone. There wasn't many foods I didn't like. My brother Stephen was funny though. He hated onions and he hated green peppers. And my mom put them in everything, except Jello. But in everything. And so my brother, he would just sit there and he'd be at the dinner table for like 2 hours because he'd pick up all those little, now he loves them and stuff, but he sat there forever. My mother taught me about weather. She said, "You know, it looks like a tornado swept through your room, Larry." She taught me about the circle of life. I brought you into this world, I can take you out. I feared my mother in a godly way and in a physical way. My son, he still fears. Michelle could actually take Caleb down still. I can't. She can. And he knows it. She's one tough girl, farm girl. My mother taught me about behavior modification. Quit acting like your father. My mother taught me about envy. There's millions of less fortunate children in this world who don't have a wonderful mother like I am. Mom, that's true. But the most important thing I remember about my mother is that little prayer that she would say over me almost daily. It would go like this: "May God help you if you ever do that again." Lord, we do thank you for our mothers here, and that we would be like Deborah's, that we would be, all of us would be, we would use the giftings that you called us to do. We would walk in the things you called us to walk into. That we would trust you that, Lord, ultimately, we know that you have everything in control, and that you are going to take care of everything. And that we just have to put our trust in you, be sensitive to your voice, be sensitive to your leading, and be on our knees daily in prayer, battling for our families, for our nation, for this world that you love so much that you sent Jesus to die for us, that we might have a relationship with you. You truly have a mother's heart, God, and help us all to have that. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take communion this morning.